So let me just introduce our speaker, Swamiji. Thank you for being here. Swami Medhananda ji was a PhD student at UCal Berkeley and finished his PhD in 2009. After that, he joined the Ramakrishna mission, the order of monks in India, and since has published a number of papers and books in philosophy, religion, and the intersection of both. In 2018, he published Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion with Oxford University Press. This is the book, we assigned excerpts from this books to y'all, and this is what we read. More recently, he's published a book on Swami Vivekananda titled Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism, 2021. So we're all excited to have you, and the virtual floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Pranav and Stephen, for inviting me to speak to you all today. And thank you all for attending. I'm speaking on Sri Ramakrishna's views on the harmony of religions. I think that there are some really unique and distinctive features of it that are worth bringing into play and discussing really seriously and critically in academic discussions of different models of religious diversity and especially religious pluralism. So let's get into it. And I'll try to keep my presentation short so I can leave ample time for whatever questions you might have. So Sri Ramakrishna was a 19th century Bengali mystic, born in 1836, passed away in 1886 at the age of 50. He's famous for having practiced spiritual disciplines in a variety of religious traditions, including Tantra, Vaishnavism, and Advaita Vedanta within Hinduism, but also practicing Islam and Christianity to a certain extent. And he had numerous types of spiritual experiences through these practices. And these experiences some of them were theistic in nature, experiences of a personal God, and others were non-theistic. For instance, the Advaitic realization of his true nature as non-dual Brahman. On the basis of his varied religious disciplines and spiritual experiences, he affirmed the harmony of all religions. And so he expresses this in different ways, but one of his most famous teachings is, as many faiths, so many paths, mot, pot, or joto mot, toto pot. But we'll encounter other formulations a bit later in the presentation as well. And I want to go more deeply into exactly how he harmonizes the world's religions, because it's easy to say it, more difficult to kind of work it out conceptually and to make it convincing. So let's begin with what I think is a useful typology introduced by Alan Race in 1983. It's become very popular, and some people point out problems with it, but I think overall, especially for our purposes now, I think it's useful to bring in the terms as long as we define the terms clearly. And so that's what I like to do. Just for the purposes of today's presentation, I'm going to define it in a simple way in terms of salvation. Exclusivism is the view that only one religion leads to salvation, while all other religions fail to lead to salvation. An example of someone who holds this view is the Protestant theologian Karl Barth. Inclusivism is the view that only one religion leads directly to salvation, but other religions lead indirectly to salvation or afford lesser forms of salvation. So examples on the Christian side would be Paul Rana, who was a Catholic theologian, a famous one from the 20th century. And on the Indian side, as I'm going to show shortly, Advaita Vedanta, I think, is a good example of an inclusivist approach to the world religions within a Hindu standpoint. And finally, religious pluralism is the view that multiple religions, meaning more than one religion, equally lead to salvation. They're in an equal position. There's no higher and lower here between the different world religions. They're all equally capable of leading us to the same goal of salvation. On the Western theological side, John Hick and Paul Knitter are some of the most well-known proponents of religious pluralist positions. And on the Indian side, I want to make the case that Sri Ramakrishna was a very robust religious pluralist. So keep in mind these definitions, different scholars define these terms in very different ways. And so this is what I'd like us to work with. And if you have problems with the definitions, of course, you can challenge them during the question. But it's a kind of conceptual framework that'll set the stage for what I'm going to say in the remainder of my presentation. So as I promised in the last slide, let me first explain briefly what is Shankara's Advaita Vedanta and why do I say that it entails an inclusivist approach to the world religion. First of all, for those of you who are not familiar with Shankara's philosophy, it's captured in a brief formula in Sanskrit, which is Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahmevana Paraha. The translation of which would be Brahman alone is real and the world is unreal. And the individual is none other than Brahman, or the individual soul is none other than Brahman. So let me unpack it a little bit. First, key claim, the soul reality is Brahman, and Brahman is understood in a very specific way as non-dual pure consciousness. Two, as a result, the world, the personal God, meaning Ishvara, and individual souls are all empirically real, but from the ultimate standpoint are non-existent. Third claim of Shankara's school, we attain liberation, which they call moksha, liberation from the cycle of rebirth, by attaining knowledge of our true nature as Brahman. In our deepest nature, we are identical with that non-dual pure consciousness. 4, Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, is the only direct path to liberation. And 5, Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of devotion, devotion for a personal God, toward a personal God. And Karma Yoga, the yoga of unselfish action, lead indirectly to liberation by purifying and concentrating the mind, thereby making us eligible to practice Jnana Yoga, which is the highest practice. So there's a clear hierarchy of spiritual practices. Only Jnana Yoga leads directly to liberation. Other paths like devotion and unselfish action are not useless, but they only take us part of the way. They make us eligible to practice the higher practice of Jnana Yoga. Okay, now, what does an Advaitic approach to harmonizing the world religions look like? I think it's inclusivist in nature. Shankara himself, by the way, he was writing in the 8th century, and so there's no question of him talking about other world religions because that just wasn't on his radar. But what I'm thinking of are more modern day Shankarites, especially in the 20th century, like Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, P.M.P. Mahadevan, if any of you are familiar with these people, who try to update Shankara's philosophy for modern times and to explain how his philosophy is relevant now. And so what they do is they try to use Shankara's ideas, but to explain how they're relevant to explaining Christianity, Islam, Judaism, theistic Hindu traditions. And this is how I see them doing it. They claim, for instance, that Christians, through the path of Christianity, by practicing the different devotional practices mentioned in the Bible, they can realize the Christian God. They can attain some spiritual experience of the Christian God, some kind of unity with the Christian God. Muslims, through the practice of Islam, based on the Quran, they can realize, they can attain a spiritual experience of God as they understand God, namely as Allah, the formless but personal God. And theistic Hindus can, through their respective theistic practices, realize the personal God in various forms, depending on what they prefer or what they love, either the form of God as Krishna or as Rama or as Kali or as Shiva, and so on and so forth. In Hinduism, there's a kind of panoply of forms of the personal God. But notice that none of them have reached the top of the mountain. This is why I call the Advaitic, the Shankarite approach to the harmony, to the world religions, inclusivistic rather than pluralistic. All they've done is realize various forms of the personal God, which is not sufficient for liberation. So according to these Advaitins, ultimately they have to practice Advaitic Jnana Yoga. They have to stop doing their devotional practices. At a certain point, they kind of outgrow devotionalism and they have to move on to the higher practice of Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, the path of discrimination. And only then can they realize the highest reality, which is impersonal, non-dual Brahman. In Sanskrit, the term is Nirguna Brahman. And it's only knowledge of that non-dual pure consciousness which constitutes liberation. Same goes for Muslims. Same goes for all theistic Hindus. And of course, we can, add other religions like Judaism and other theistic religions, Sufism and Sikhism. Sufism would fall under Islam. Okay, so this is in a nutshell what I take to be the Advaitic inclusivist approach to the world religion. And I want to contrast this inclusivist framework taught by Shankara's followers with Ramakrishna's more robustly pluralistic paradigm. So this is what I'll talk about for the remainder of the presentation. So his views on the harmony of religions are grounded in a very special spiritual state, which he calls Vijnana. And this is a passage from his teachings where I think he explains clearly two stages in spiritual experience, which he calls Jnana and Vijnana. I'm just going to try to explain them. So he says, the Jnani, meaning the knower of non-dual pure consciousness. So this is basically a follower of Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta, gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, not this. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. But the Vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized as Brahman through the eliminating process of not this, neti neti, is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings. The Vijnani sees that the reality which is impersonal, nirguna, is also personal, saguna. This is known as Vijnana. So what is the difference in the outlook between the Jnani, basically a follower of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, and what Sri Ramakrishna is calling a Vijnani? As I see it, the Jnani is the traditional Advaita Vedantin who attains spiritual realization of the impersonal, non-dual Brahman through the practice of the yoga of knowledge, Jnana Yoga. The Vijnani first attains the state of Jnana, but then he goes beyond the Advaita Jnani by realizing that Brahman is not only impersonal, nirguna, but also personal, saguna. And while the Jnani dismisses the universe as a framework of illusion, the Bengali here is dhokartati, the Vijnani embraces the universe as a mansion of mirth, mojarkuti, as a real manifestation of God. So I think the two key differences between the Jnani and the Vijnani, number one is with respect to their understanding of God, the Jnani only accepts impersonal, non-dual pure consciousness, does not accept the ultimate reality of the personal God, whereas the Vijnani sees God as equally personal and impersonal, and sees non-dual pure consciousness as the impersonal or static aspect of the divine reality, and sees the different forms of the personal God as different forms of the personal dimension of the same infinite divine reality. And the second key difference is that whereas followers of Shankara look upon this world as a dream or as unreal, Vijnanis embrace it as a real manifestation of the personal God, of Shakti. So these three tenets, I hope, succinctly capture the main tenets of his philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. Number one, the sole reality is the infinite divine reality, which is the impersonal, non-dual Brahman in one aspect, and the personal God, otherwise known as Shakti. He calls it Shakti in a number of places, in another aspect. So one of his favorite teachings was Brahma or Shakti Abhed in Bengali, which means the impersonal, non-dual pure consciousness on the one hand, and Shakti, meaning the personal God on the other, are inseparable but equally real aspects of the same divine reality. Second tenet of Vijnana Vedanta, the world and all individual souls are real manifestations of Shakti, of the personal God. And three, all four yogas, Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Raja Yoga, the yoga of meditation, are all direct paths to the goal of God realization. He doesn't have a hierarchy of yogas, putting Jnana Yoga or Bhakti Yoga or any other yoga for that matter on a higher footing than the others. Finally then, so now that we have a sense of his ontological framework based on the spiritual state of Vijnana, how does he arrive at religious pluralism? This is how I see him doing it. He teaches that God is infinite and the paths to God are infinite. This is my favorite formulation of his religious pluralism. The original Bangla is Tini Ananto Patho Ananto. And part of the reason why I like it is because he explains in this teaching why there are infinite paths to the same goal of God realization. There are infinite paths because God himself is infinite. God himself or herself. In Hinduism, it could be herself, and often is. So because God is infinite and has both personal and impersonal dimensions, there are also correspondingly infinite paths to God. And he employs a really unique parable, the parable of a chameleon, to illustrate the harmony of all the religions from the spiritual standpoint of Vijnana. So this is what he says. He says, once a man entered a forest and saw a small animal on a tree. He came back and told another man that he had seen a creature of a beautiful red color on a certain tree. The second man replied, when I went into the forest, I also saw that animal. But why do you call it red? It is green. Another man who was present contradicted them both and insisted that it was yellow. Presently, others arrived and contended that it was gray, violet, blue, and so forth and so on. At last, they started quarreling among themselves. To settle the dispute, they all went to the tree. They saw a man sitting under it. On being asked, he replied, yes, I live under this tree and I know the animal very well. All your descriptions are true. Sometimes it appears red, sometimes yellow, and at other times blue, violet, gray, and so forth. It is a chameleon, and sometimes it has no color at all. Now it has a color, and now it has none. In like manner, one who constantly thinks of God can know God's real nature. He alone knows that God reveals himself to seekers in various forms and aspects. God is personal as well as impersonal. Only the man who lives under the tree knows that the chameleon can appear in various colors, and he knows further that the animal at times has no color at all. It is the others who suffer from the agony of futile argument. So I want to bring your attention to two aspects of this parable in particular. The first is, notice that the chameleon sometimes assumes different colors, blue, violet, gray, yellow, whatever. All of these colors of the chameleon correspond to different forms of the personal God. But the chameleon also is sometimes colorless. And obviously, I don't know how obvious it is, but it corresponds to the impersonal, non-dual Brahman of Advaita Vedanta, right? It has no color at all. That means it's impersonal. And notice that there's one person who's kind of unique, because instead of just sort of coming to the tree for a few minutes and then going away, this is the person who lives under the tree. So this person, this unique person who kind of lives under the tree 24 hours a day, is the Vijnani, who sees God in multiple aspects, just as this person sees the chameleon in different colors and sometimes it's colorless. Because it's only the Vijnani who has this more expansive experience or realization of God in various forms of the personal God and as non-dual pure consciousness. So keep these two aspects of the parable in mind. So now, with this in the background, this is how I would put in the form of a diagram Ramakrishna's understanding of the harmony of all the world religions. So Christians, through the practice of Christianity, can directly realize some aspect or form of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality, which leads directly to salvation. Same goes for Muslims, same goes for Hindus, same goes for Advaita Vedantins, for whom the ultimate reality is non-dual pure consciousness. Same goes for Buddhists. And these are just examples, but you can multiply religions and examples as you wish. So you can see why this is pluralistic in contrast to the inclusivist paradigm I had diagrammed earlier with regard to Shankara's philosophy, because they can reach the goal directly and there's no hierarchy of higher and lower here. So let me try to unpack that a little bit more now. So first of all, I think Ramakrishna is also unique in defending a very expansive conception of final post-mortem salvation. Post-mortem, after you leave the physical body, but assuming that you have attained the highest goal of your religion, what happens to you? That's the question. What happens to your eternal soul? According to Ramakrishna, there are two fundamentally different types of spiritual aspirants. Bhaktas, meaning devotionally oriented people who strive to cultivate a loving relationship with the personal God. This includes theistic Hindus, but also Christians, Jews, Muslims, and so on. And jnanis, intellectually oriented people like Advaita Vedantas and Buddhists who strive for nirvana, a salvific state in which no sense of individuality remains. And in contrast to traditional schools of Vedanta, not just Advaita Vedanta, but there are many other schools of Vedanta, including Ramanuja's, Vishishtadvaita, Madhva's Dvaita Vedanta, and I won't go into the details. But in contrast to all of these traditional schools of Vedanta, Ramakrishna grants equal value to both the Advaitic and devotional ideals of salvation. And according to Ramakrishna, then, the form of salvation we choose or that we end up in depends on our individual temperament and preference and the kind of practices we were engaged in while we're in this physical body. So while some spiritual aspirants seek to merge their individuality in the impersonal, non-dual Brahman, like Advaita Vedantins, devotees of the personal God tend to prefer to retain a sense of individuality in order to enjoy the bliss of loving communion with the personal God. So they prefer to maintain some differentiation between themselves and God so that they can worship God and love God and serve God. As Ramakrishna likes to put it, devotees prefer to eat sugar while Advaitins want to become sugar. So eating sugar and becoming sugar are just different paradigms, but equally valuable paradigms of salvation. According to Ramakrishna, various theistic and non-theistic religious paths are equally capable of leading to salvific realization of the infinite divine reality. But salvation itself takes multiple forms. He conceives this divine reality expansively as both the impersonal non-dual absolute on the one hand, Brahman, as well as the personal God, Shakti. Accordingly, his conception of the salvific goal of all religions is equally expansive. For non-theistic spiritual aspirants like Advaita Vedantins and some Buddhists, assuming that they've attained the highest goal of their religion, salvation consists in the total dissolution of their individuality in non-dual Brahman. By contrast, for spiritual aspirants in theistic religious traditions like Vaishnavism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, salvation takes the form of eternal loving communion with the personal God in a transcendental realm. However that's understood, it could be a Christian heaven or a Muslim heaven or a Vaishnava heaven. Since there are various lokas, which in Sanskrit means realms or worlds, these are transcendental realms. These are I don't think the word is extraterrestrial, that sounds weird, but super terrestrial realms beyond this earth. Because there are various lokas in Hinduism, which Ramakrishna accepts, there are also multiple theistic forms of salvation. Just to give you an example, while devotees of Krishna, the personal God Krishna, so these are Vaishnavas, they can dwell eternally with their beloved Krishna in Vaikuntha Loka. Vaikuntha Loka is not accurate here. It's actually Goloka. Goloka or Vrindavana, that's the term. Christians can dwell with Christ or God the Father in their Christian heaven. Muslims can commune with Allah in their eternal paradise called Jannah in Arabic, I believe, and so on. In short, Ramakrishna was not only a religious pluralist who held that different religious paths are equally capable of taking us to salvation, but he was also a salvific pluralist. This is just the term I'm throwing out there. In that he held that salvation itself takes a variety of forms depending on the temperament and preferences of individual souls. So now comes a thorny question. I don't know to what extent you've discussed this issue in your class, but this is a huge issue. Anytime you talk about religious theories of religious pluralism, the big problem which any theory of religious pluralism has to face is what's called the problem of conflicting religious truth claims. In a nutshell, the problem is this: if different religions make conflicting claims about historical and metaphysical realities, how can all religions be valid? I'm using vague language here on purpose, okay? But let me give you two concrete examples. Did Christ die on the cross? Christianity's answer is yes. Islam's answer is no. Okay. Another example, is reincarnation true? Is it true that we're reborn in multiple physical bodies? Hinduism and Buddhism answer in the affirmative. Orthodox Christianity, Orthodox Judaism, Orthodox Islam answer in the negative. They don't accept the doctrine of reincarnation or rebirth. So now the problem seems to come that, well, if you're affirming the equal truth of Christianity and Islam and Hinduism and Judaism, then you seem to be committing contradictions. Because then you're saying that Christ did die on the cross and that Christ did not die on the cross. And you're saying that reincarnation is true because you're affirming the truth of Hinduism and Buddhism. And you're saying that reincarnation is not true because you're also affirming the truth of Christianity and Judaism and Islam in their orthodox forms. So now, how does Ramakrishna respond to this problem? This is what I think is crucial. Ramakrishna never claims that all religions are true. He claims that all religions are salvifically efficacious, which means they're equally effective in leading to the goal of salvation. Okay, now let me explain that in a little bit more detail. But to do that, I'd like to bring in a classification made by John Hick. I'm sure most of you are at least familiar with the name, if not some of his ideas. He distinguishes three different kinds of conflicting religious truth claims. The first kind is disagreements about past historical events, quote, that are in principle accessible to human observation. So the question of whether Christ died on the cross would neatly fall under this first category. If somebody were present in, at year zero, at, in that place, somebody could just tell us whether or not Christ died on the cross, right? Second, disagreements about what Hick calls trans-historical matters, which cannot be verified by historical or other evidence. Now, Hick himself, at the time he was writing, which was 1989, he felt that rebirth was a good example of a trans-historical matter because he knew that there was some empirical evidence in favor of rebirth, but he didn't think it was strong enough to be decisive. And so he put that in the trans-historical category. Now, which disagreements you fit under historical events and which you fit under trans-historical is an open question, and you can kind of debate about that. But I want us to just keep in mind this classification. And third, disagreements about ultimate questions, such as the nature of ultimate reality. Is God personal or impersonal? Does God have form or is God formless? These are examples of disagreements about ultimate questions. Now, let's keep the classification in mind. I think Ramakrishna adopts a particular stance toward 1 and 2 and a different stance toward 3. So first, what is Ramakrishna's stance toward 1 and 2? His stance on conflicting historical and trans-historical religious truth claims. According to Ramakrishna, historical and trans-historical doctrines are not soteriologically vital. It means even if certain religions are wrong about historical and trans-historical issues, it doesn't handicap them from the standpoint of salvation. This is what he says. That yearning, in the original Bengali term here is bakulata. That yearning for God is the whole thing. Whatever path you follow, whether you are a Hindu, a Muslim, a Christian, a Shakta, a Vaishnava, or a Brahma, the vital point is yearning. God is our inner guide, Antaryami. It doesn't matter if you take a wrong path, only you must be restless for him. God himself will put you on the right path. Besides, there are errors in all paths. Everyone thinks his watch is right, but as a matter of fact, no watch is absolutely right. But that doesn't hamper one's work. So I think he's saying a lot of important things in this passage. So number one, no religion in this world has a monopoly on the truth. No religion is 100% true. He likens each world religion to a watch. And his idea is, his point is, let's assume, just to stipulate, that no watch tells exactly the correct time. Similarly, no religion is 100% true. So every religion has at least some errors. But he says, the errors in these religions don't handicap them from the standpoint of salvation, which means that doesn't mean that they're any less effective in leading to salvation. They're true enough to get the job done, basically. And then he adds that the common denominator among all the world's religious saints, regardless of what religious tradition they belong to, is that they had this intense yearning to realize God, an intense love and yearning for God. That's the real criterion, and that's common across the different religious traditions. You might catch out yearning in a slightly different way when you talk about non-theistic religions like Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism, but they're still yearning in those traditions. It's just yearning for liberation rather than yearning for the personal God. Okay. Now, I think he adopts an interestingly different stance on number 3, the third type of conflicting religious truth claim, namely truth claims about ultimate reality. From the standpoint of Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, religious truth claims about ultimate reality are complementary rather than conflicting. And he uses a different parable, the parable of the blind man and the elephant, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with, in order to illustrate this. He claims that each religion captures a unique aspect or form of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality, but no religion captures the whole of the infinite reality. So this is his parable. He says, one can rightly speak of God only after one has seen him. He who has seen God knows really and truly that God has form and that he is formless as well. He has many other aspects that cannot be described. Once some blind men chanced to come near an elephant. A person explained to them, this animal is an elephant. They were asked what the elephant was like. The blind men began to feel its body. One of them said the elephant was like a pillar. He had only touched its leg. Another said it was like a winnowing fan. He had touched only its ear. In this way, the others, having touched its tail or belly, gave their different versions of the elephant. Just so, a man who has seen only one aspect of God limits God to that alone. It is his conviction that God cannot be anything else. So again, he's saying some important things here. Number one, he's saying that the person who has sight, it corresponds to the Vijnani. Remember the Vijnani who experiences God in multiple forms and aspects, as opposed to these blind men who are only experiencing one aspect of the elephant corresponding to God. And one thing that's striking about this is that these are people who have actually had a spiritual experience of God. These are not ordinary souls. These are people who have realized God. But the problem is that they've only realized God in a particular form or aspect. And so they think that the particular aspect or form of God that they have experienced exhausts the whole nature of God. That's the mistake that these people are making. And then this Vijnani comes along, corresponding to the person who can see the whole elephant, who corrects them and says, you're all right, because you're all experiencing different aspects and forms of God, but you're all wrong in thinking that the elephant is just the part of the elephant that you're touching, namely that you're experiencing. But one caveat, which Ramakrishna also adds, is that even the Vijnani does not experience the whole of God. So this is where this parable can become misleading unless or if you try to push it too far. So the Vijnani does not see the whole of God. Nobody can experience the whole of God because God is infinite. And he uses a different parable to explain this. And I'm just going to mention it briefly. He says, an ant went to a giant hill of sugar and takes one grain of that sugar and then becomes a little arrogant and says, next time I'm going to go and take the entire hill of sugar. And then Ramakrishna laughs and says, that's never possible. Nobody can attain spiritual knowledge of the entirety of God, of the whole of God. But that's not even necessary. All you need for God realization is to realize some aspect or form of God. The Vijnani realizes more of God than most saints, but even the Vijnani does not realize the whole of God. So I think that's important to keep in mind, because one of the standard criticisms of the blind man and the elephant is that nobody can possibly know the whole of God. Nobody is in the vantage point of the person who has sight, who can see the entire elephant. Ramakrishna agrees, but he says that some saints nonetheless have a more expansive knowledge of God than other people who have experienced God. That's what he calls the Vijnani. And I just want to sum up my presentation in the next two slides. Just to summarize, what I take to be the four key advantages of Ramakrishna's Vijnana-based religious pluralism over against other competing theories of religious pluralism, like John Hicks, for instance. Number one, the major world religions are equally effective paths to realizing some aspect or form of one and the same impersonal, personal, infinite reality. Two, since the personal God and the impersonal absolute, meaning non-dual pure consciousness, are different but equally real aspects of one and the same infinite divine reality, theistic and non-theistic religions are placed on an equal ontological footing. I think one of the weaknesses of some forms of religious pluralism out there is that there tends to be a bias either toward theism or to some non-theistic tradition, putting one in some sense higher than the other. And that's not something that Ramakrishna does. He puts theistic and non-theistic traditions on an equal footing. Third advantage, he has, as I mentioned earlier, an expansive view of salvation. And I think this is quite distinctive. I'm not aware of other theologians who have defended this kind of view. Instead of imposing a single narrow salvific goal onto all of the world religions, Ramakrishna teaches that a theist can dwell in an eternal heaven with the personal God. And even among theists, he distinguishes the Christian heaven from the Islamic heaven, Jinnah or Jannah, from the Vaishnava heaven of Hindus. And he says they're all true. And they're all, just as a mansion can have many, many rooms, and you can inhabit whatever room you want in the mansion, why can't we conceive salvation as a kind of many-roomed mansion where different souls are inhabiting different forms of salvation? And on the other hand, an Advaitin can merge his or her individuality in non-dual pure consciousness. It's a radically different form of salvation, which is equally true and equally valuable. And fourth and finally, Ramakrishna's broad conception of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality provides an ontological rationale for active interreligious dialogue. What do I mean by that? Well, remember Ramakrishna's response to the third kind of conflicting religious truth claim, namely truth claims about the nature of ultimate reality. And his basic take is that all of the different world religions say interestingly different but complementary things about the same infinite divine reality. Therefore, we stand to learn a great deal by learning about religious traditions other than our own. We can learn more about God, about God's infinite nature. By learning about Islam, I get to learn about the formless but personal God in the form of Allah. By reading the Bible, I get to learn more about God as Christ, God as an incarnation, and God as Father in the Christian sense. And so on and so forth. I can expose myself to other religious views of the ultimate reality, thereby gaining a more comprehensive understanding of God. And that provides a really strong ontological basis for having interreligious dialogue. I can talk with Christians, Muslims, and other people, followers of other religious faiths, because we can all respect each other and also accept that all of our different conceptions of God are complementary rather than conflicting. So if you're interested in further details, please look at chapters 3 and 4 of my book. Especially in chapter 4, I bring Ramakrishna's religious pluralism into dialogue with John Hicks. And I present a really new argument there, a new reading of Hicks' views, where I interpret them diachronically. And I claim that he actually has two different views of religious pluralism, one from 1970 to 1974, and again, one from 1976 onward. And that people have ignored the earlier form of religious pluralism, which is explicitly Vedantic, based on Sri Aurobindo's logic of the infinite, and it comes very close to Ramakrishna. And my main argument is that he should have stuck to that original theory of religious pluralism and focused on that more than giving that up and bringing in Kant's realization, complicating things, and I think messing things up a bit. All right. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you again for being here. It was a really interesting presentation. I had a question about like the multiple conceptions of God. How would like saying that God can be any way for like different people, how would that not violate like the fact that like one claim can be true and like basically like trying to think of how to phrase this.
No, I already get the question, so I can answer it. So I think it's a great question. Yeah. So Ramakrishna uses a nice analogy, which I didn't mention in the presentation, but he likens the infinite God to an infinite ocean. And he says that just as the ocean can form into different forms of ice through, and he uses a metaphor here, he says, under the cooling influence of the wind of bhakti. Bhakti meaning devotion for the personal God, right? So just as an ocean can form into one shape of an iceberg in one place and another iceberg in another place, and so there can be, without violating the law of non-contradiction, right? Just so God can manifest as Christ to Christians, as Allah to Muslims, as Krishna to Vaishnavas, and as without violating the law of non-contradiction. Does that make sense, or do you have like a follow-up question?
Yeah. Could you just talk a little bit more, I guess, about how then that would reconcile the conflicting truth claims? Because if God would manifest himself to one particular group of people saying that like this manifestation is like the way, like how would you reconcile that?
Well, that's the interesting thing. I mean, does God and has God ever actually come and told whatever, some great mystic, look at me, I'm Christ, and then added, I'm the only way? I think it's an interesting question. I think it's worth. I would love to hear it, but I have not encountered any mystical testimony saying that God appeared to me and told me that all other religions are wrong. But it would be a really interesting issue if that were the case. I mean, are you thinking of anything in particular? Because I think what happens is that people who have experienced God in a particular way just get so enthusiastic about that aspect of God that they then go on to kind of infer from the experience exclusivistic or fanatical claims that only their religion is true and only their understanding of God is true. But I'm not sure that it's built into the spiritual experience itself. That's just my hunch, though.
So my question was more, it was on the yearning part of this.
Yeah.
How would you account for like atheists or people that don't necessarily have or practice a certain type of yearning towards a God or an ultimate reality?
Right. Well, I mean, they're not practicing a religion, I guess, right? Is that what you're assuming? Or
yeah, but like, so I guess my question is more, do they reach salvation? Do they get their own salvation? Like how, what's their
oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, look, I mean, one thing I didn't mention in detail here is that Hindus believe in rebirth. And so Ramakrishna's view is that every single soul will ultimately attain salvation, but not necessarily in this birth, in this embodiment. So I think in the case of atheists who don't follow any kind of religious path, I mean, if it's like an exceptionally ethical atheist who's just full of compassion, completely unselfish, desireless, right, completely devoid of worldly desires, then even that atheist could theoretically attain salvation. I don't see anything in Ramakrishna's teachings that would not allow that. But more realistically, I imagine that an atheist who's kind of at least done good actions in this life, which means, you know, helping others and trying to be unselfish and less egoistic, in his or her next birth, physical embodiment, he or she might be in a better position, born into different circumstances, such that he or she may follow a religious path and then make further spiritual progress and ultimately attain the goal of salvation. So there's not a single soul will end up in a hell. He didn't believe in an infernal hell. Everybody will get salvation, but not necessarily in this life. And that applies just as much to atheists as to anyone else.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, yeah, I was wondering, so this practice of being an expert in many different religions, and being able to engage in kind of in a religious dialogue, this is obviously like a really big task. And I was wondering if you believe that you can really truly do this unless you dedicate your life to it, or become a monk or something like that.
That's an interesting question. I mean, look, I mean, you know, there's no like one right way to acquaint yourself with other religions. I think that, you know, you can take it as far as you want, you know, and one person is busy with, you know, his or her raising a family and her job and isn't that interested. Look, the main thing is be deeply committed to your religious tradition and don't look down on other traditions. And, you know, if in your free time, try to pick a second religion that kind of maybe resonates with you most deeply, and then, you know, in your free time, read a little bit about it, read the relevant religious scripture, maybe meet some sincere practitioners of that religion. I mean, these are things that I think anybody, no matter how busy they are, can do on weekends or, you know, after they come back from work. And it doesn't. I certainly don't want to give the impression that what's expected of us is that we become like full-time sort of students or professors of world religions. I mean, that's absolutely not. That's not. Ramakrishna himself was not an academic, and he didn't expect anyone else to be. But this is more from the standpoint of spiritual practice. I mean, we should be thinking about this from the standpoint of being a spiritual aspirant and trying to learn as much as we can to make spiritual progress by learning about other religions and trying to incorporate aspects of other religions into our own practice. I think that's a very useful thing, which I try to do in my own practice. Incorporating Buddhist mindfulness techniques into my practice, incorporating aspects of Christ teachings into my practice, things like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I was also wondering if quickly you could talk about any mystical experiences you've had or someone close to you.
I've never had any, so I'm still working on it. In terms of what other people have had, you know, in our tradition strongly discourages monks from talking about their experiences, and even if they had them, they would either deny it or just not, because there's always a danger of kind of developing ego, and especially in the West now, it's like to establish your spiritual street cred, all you have to say is I've attained enlightenment, and then you'll have 100 million followers. And it's so easy to, you know, become a guru now. Everybody, there's a saying in India, everybody wants to be a guru, nobody wants to be a disciple. And so, yeah, we don't really talk about these things much. But I mean, so instead, we talk about Ramakrishna's spiritual experience. We talk about Vivekananda's spiritual experiences. And I think that's enough for us. But if you have any, like a more specific question about which is relevant to the presentation, I'd be happy to try to answer that.
So hi, first off, thank you so much for coming to present. Something I'm really curious about. So we read one of your works in preparation for like this, or like something that, you know, you had endorsed. And like, I'm really curious about how to balance ego, and because like it's really interesting that you just like brought up like monks don't really share their own religious experiences because it gives you a sense of superiority or of importance within your own religion. So how do you balance ego and selflessness and devotion to a higher being and like recognizing your own limits as human with propagating your religion? Because ideally, like you would want to spread your word if you so believed it was right. And I could really use some more clarification.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great, very, very practical question, which is relevant to all of us, especially monks who tend to sort of give more lectures, like someone like me. And not just that, I also publish academic books and articles, and that can also easily go to my head. And so, yeah, that's something you have to be very careful about. And what there's another saying among monks is that even after a monk has overcome the two great temptations in spiritual life, which is lust and greed, right? I mean, by practicing celibacy and poverty, there is a third great temptation, which is the desire for name and fame, which is what you're talking about. And so you always have to be extra careful, extra mindful, and always have to be asking yourself as you engage in lectures, as you receive both criticism and praise because of your lectures and because of in my case, academic publications and all that, how do I react? And is it puffing up my ego? If so, I better recalibrate and kind of, it's all about having the right attitude. It's not about like certain things, certain actions are inherently more egoistic than others. I don't think that's true. You can be worshiping God in a temple in a really egoistic way, or you could be doing academic work in a very unegoistic way. So it's all about a change of attitude. And so the important thing is to be mindful of yourself as you're engaging in these activities and asking yourself, to what extent is my ego involved in my academic work, in my preaching work? Does that make sense? And that's really a case-to-case basis. There's no like one-size-fits-all answer. That's the struggle in spiritual life if you are more public facing. Yeah, thanks.
So my question is, in terms of your like day-to-day lifestyle, with like religious and spiritual practice, how does a pluralist view on the world impact like your day-to-day life? I just want to I'm kind of curious as to how like I can like change the way I live. So I'm kind of curious as to how you live your day-to-day life with this kind of belief.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I already kind of briefly hinted at it before, but for instance, we sit for meditation 2 or 3 times a day, and we have our own specific Hindu practice based on our tradition, the Ramakrishna tradition. At the same time, I have actively incorporated spiritual practices from Buddhism and from Christianity. And in our shrine, we have a picture of Jesus, and we worship Jesus as an incarnation. And the only difference between Orthodox Christianity and Hinduism on this front is Christians say that Christ is the only incarnation, whereas Hindus accept Christ as an incarnation and say, but we also accept other incarnations, like Buddha and Rama and Krishna and Ramakrishna. That's an example. Another thing is I love Western classical music, and some of my favorite Western classical music is Christian sacred music. There's incredible Christian music composed by the great composers like Bach and Mozart and Beethoven. Like one of my favorites is Bach's Mass in B minor, but he has over 200, I think exactly 200 church cantatas, and with lyrics. And I mean, I especially like Christian choral music. And then there are also beautiful classical compositions based on the Psalms found in the Hebrew Bible, which express what Ramakrishna calls longing for God. And so this is part of I consider it a spiritual practice to listen with total concentration to beautiful Western classical music based on Christian themes. Yeah, I hope that begins to answer your question. But so the point is, I mean, each of you will have to decide for yourself. There's no one size fits all answer to that either. Thanks.
I think I'll go ahead and jump in for a second if you don't mind then. So yeah, I'm a philosopher by training, so my questions probably always sound really snarky, but like I really appreciate what you're doing, and I feel like this is something I need to spend a lot more time thinking through and trying to understand and internalize. I'm going to, at least for the moment, go with my philosopher's instincts and try to break it to try to understand it better. So I want to think about cases that where it seems unacceptable to take this kind of many-roomed mansion approach. So let's say, for instance, that you are the kind of Christian who worships at the Westboro Baptist Church, and part of your image of God is specifically contains ideas like God hates certain kinds of people and will condemn them to eternal damnation. And in a very like specific and potent form of eternal damnation. So I'm wondering if there's room in this view to say, okay, so maybe there's a Christian path or many Christian paths, but some Christian paths are better than others. At the end of the day, whatever the Christian aspect of the many-roomed mansion looks like, it's probably not like that, or it isn't like that. That at some point that idea you have that the God worth worshiping is a God who hates, like that has to go. Does this make sense?
Sort of. I mean, if I understand you correctly, but I think this goes back to conflicting truth claims about, so in your case, I think in your question is about the conflicting truth claims about the nature of the final eschatological state, the final state of salvation. Mm-hmm. And what you're saying is that some forms of Christianity, for instance, posit an eternal hell, mm-hmm. which Ramakrishna doesn't. And so, but as I said, I mean, so the key here is distinguishing his religious pluralism, which is based on salvation, not in terms of truth. So he's just going to say, I disagree with these Baptists who believe in an eternal hell. I think they're wrong about that. Nonetheless, through the Baptist path, they can also realize God.
Yeah.
And they might be unhappy about it in the end, but they're going to find out eventually that non-Baptists don't end up in an eternal hell. Tough for them is, I think, what his line would be on that.
Okay. So then I think then this is going to get me into a question that I originally had when I read your paper, and that I'm having a really hard time formulating, because I think, and Pranav and I have had some discussions in this space, that I'm a bit baffled about what it means for God, for instance, to be colored as Allah versus as the Christian God, either Christ or Father versus Krishna or something like that. And the reason why I find it puzzling is because I don't quite know what the type of religious experience being described is. So like the Islamic notion of Allah is relatively thin. So it doesn't have a lot of specific attributes to it, right? Whereas if you talked about an experience of Christ, then so I mean this is my background, right? Like I come from a Christian background, so most of the time when Christians say, I was praying the other day and I heard from Jesus, like they don't mean they heard a voice that sounded like a first century Jew. They don't mean they saw a person with holes in his hands. They just mean they felt some internal sense of guidance, which they attribute the name Jesus to. Does this make sense? If we think about an experience qua Jesus experience, then it seems like it almost must include some specific details, like he's got holes in his hands. And so if we make the religious experiences distinct enough to kind of make sense of this multivalenced revelation that God is doing, then it seems like the trans-historical and historical claims leak back in. Right. So if God presents in in the Christian part of the many-roomed mansion, does Christ have holes in his hands? Because if he does, then that seems like it rules out the idea that the Muslims had about Jesus. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I think one thing is we have to separate conceptually mystics who experience some form or aspect of God while in the physical body with the final state of salvation. I think you're mixing up those two things, but I think it's important to keep them separate. Okay. So with regard to mystics in the physical body experiencing God, I see absolutely no reason why Teresa of Avila can't have a particular experience of Christ literally with holes in his hands, or St. Francis, who had stigmata, right? And somebody else like Meister Eckhart, who is more of a kind of a impersonal sort of a mystic of Christianity, who realizes the same Christ, but in a radically different way, formless and whatever, possibly non-dual. That's perfectly coherent. I think what you're asking is more about the problem might come in arguably at the level of salvation. But as I said, I see nothing in Ramakrishna's teachings that prohibits the possibility that there are multiple Christian heavens in this final eschatological state. And that the Baptist Christian heaven might be different from the Catholic one. Why not? I don't see, and God is omnipotent. And if we can create, if Kanye can have a mansion with, 20 rooms, why can't God have one with 1,000?
All right, Steve, I'm going to use my instructor privilege and insert myself. I know Brian and Snail, you have questions, but you've gone once. Let me just quickly jump in if you guys don't mind. Swamiji, that was great. I have a quick question. So in the chameleon case, the seemingly contradictory attributes sort of get resolved through the testimony of the person who sits underneath the tree and tells how, all of these things aren't really contradictory. But in addition to that, you might think we know enough about like science and how, chameleons work and so on. So we have like a theoretical understanding of how, a chameleon could present itself in different ways. So there's the testimony, but there's also the theoretical understanding. Now, going to Ramakrishna's case, I'm wondering how much of the argument just depends on the Vijnani's testimony, and how much of it, is there like a parallel sort of theoretical understanding of how the same personal reality could be impersonal, and how panentheism and completely a transcendent God could fit together. Are there like arguments from Yukti or something like that to do that, or must we take the Vijnani's testimony?
I mean, look, I think that you're right that the Vijnani's testimony is significant, but I don't think it's the only testimony. I think all the mystical testimony in the world is testimony that's relevant. All of the theistic mystics who have realized different forms of the personal God, it's all relevant testimony. And it all shows, right? When you couple that with the Vijnani's testimony, all mystical testimony becomes relevant. Because then the more testimony we get from different mystics, the better our understanding of God and its infinite nature. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you're saying it's not like sort of one person or one kind
No, absolutely not. Every single, the moment from the Vijnani standpoint, all mystical testimony gives us a better understanding of God. That's the beauty of it, is that you can embrace all mystical testimony throughout the world, because every mystic has realized God in a distinctive way, each of which is valuable if you accept the Vijnani standpoint, right? So then that's the, and if you don't accept the Vijnani standpoint, it's, I accept mystic X, but I reject everybody else's testimony as false. But that's not the Vijnani says, no, they're all true. They're just realizing different aspects and forms of the same infinite God.
Yeah, that's helpful. If I may, a very quick follow-up. So a lot of this depends on mysticism, which is a very, historically, it's an open question how central it was to Hinduism. For instance, I'm not sure how central it is to Shankara, who probably doesn't speak highly of mysticism. But definitely when it comes to Islam and Christianity, mysticism is sort of like this, esoteric thing that they don't know what to do with, etc. Like this is like channeling some perennialists, right? They're like, we don't know what to do with like someone like a Eckhart or Mansur al-Hallaj, etc. They're very peripheral figures. And so dialectically, I'm not sure how effective the strategy is if it relies so much on on mysticism?
Right. Okay, that's an interesting question. I mean, how would I answer this? Even if we set aside the issue of mystical experience, what if we just kind of let's bracket that out just for the purpose of your question and focus on salvation, which is something that all Orthodox Muslims, Christians, and Jews accept. Post-mortem salvation. So now there's no question of mysticism anymore. Once I leave the body and theoretically obtain, salvation, what does that salvation look like? I still think we can bring in a model like Ramakrishna.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, so the whole it's not that he's putting all his eggs in the mystical basket, because he's also talking about salvation in this very capacious way.
No, I get that, and we could continue, but let's get in Brian and Snail. Brian.
So I kind of want to go back to the salvation thing, because it seems sort of lacking to me in some way, sort of contradictory, because like you said salvation is God realization, but then you also talked about the multi-room mansion and how like a Christian's concept of salvation or a Christian's salvation can be different than a Muslim's, can be different than a Hindu's. And I fail to see how that's different than kind of like the blind man parable. And in our lives, going through trying to find salvation, living our lives and everything, we only understand this one aspect of God, and that's how we try to find salvation. But then once we get salvation, we are still stuck on that one aspect. It feels to me salvation should be that higher realization of, I'm not stuck in this room, but I can see the mansion for the entire thing it is. I can see the entire mansion, right, not just the one room. Because I feel like the one room is still constricting. Like, I get how
I get it. No, I think that's a nice question. I mean, all I'll say is that, I think it's, again, nothing in Ramakrishna's teachings precludes the possibility of somebody who's like sort of, whose salvation consists in sort of hopping back and forth between different rooms. Like, that's fine. But now, on the other hand, I think what you're saying is, to you, it seems somehow natural to think that the most comprehensive form of salvation is the best. And that's where I think Ramakrishna would part ways with you and say, why should that be the case? Somebody just wants to be in a certain room. What does that look like? How does that cash out in terms of these enlightened souls? It means I love God as Christ, right? So that's not at all feeling like you're stuck in a room. It means I want to stay here because I love God as Christ. Not that I don't accept God as Allah or God as Krishna. Let those people who are worshippers of Krishna and worshippers of Allah be in those rooms. But I love my Christ, and I'm perfectly satisfied with that. If after, one eon, somehow I suddenly decide, wait a minute, I just want to get a glimpse of what God as Allah looks like, and then I can hop into that room, and then I can hop back to my Christ, But so the metaphor of feeling stuck in a room is only relevant if you really are unhappy, or like if you're unhappy with the fact that you're only realizing in one form or aspect. But Ramakrishna's whole point is, different people love to think of God and experience God in different ways. Just because there's a difference in the temperament of different souls, different souls just prefer to think of God and relish God in different forms.
Okay, it kind of makes.
One example might be like food. I think that could be a useful thing. Like, you can say like, I like certain foods and don't like other foods. You might say, well, isn't it better to eat everything? Well, no. I mean, I don't want to be forced fed food I don't like. Right.
I get that. Yeah. I think, I guess like if you get the concept of, as long as you know that God are in those other forms, but you only want to stay with that. That makes sense.
That's it. That's it. That's exactly the way to put it. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so I have like two questions. The first one is kind of like, from my understanding, this pluralist view comes from like the flexibility of Hinduism. Like at the very groundwork of this view, it seems to me that you kind of need to have flexibility in all the different things that you can believe, or like the divinity of different things, if that makes sense. And a lot of other religions don't have that much flexibility. So wouldn't you say that positions Hindus to like accept this view more easily? And then how could you like say that people that don't have that level of flexibility can also accept this? Well,
I mean, look, at the end of the day, whether people of other religious traditions will accept Ramakrishna's religious pluralism is a, that's up in the air, and it's an empirical question, and there are many who will accept it and many who won't, and that's not in our hands. I mean, and how to make this view palatable to them is a very, very good question, an urgent one, but one that is beyond my pay grade, I think. I mean, like there's something in the religious temperament sometimes in some religions that lends itself to fanaticism, and to think that it's like there's this born again mentality, of some enthusiastic religious people, like, I've figured it out, my way has to be the only way. There's just something deeply ingrained in human nature, which doesn't mean everybody feels that way, but a lot of people do. And how can we combat that? Well, I mean, one way is, practically speaking, is to introduce these people to the more liberal dimensions of their own religion. So in Islam, you have terrorists, but you also have great liberal Sufi mystics and saints. I mean, to give you a concrete example, Dara Shikoh was an incredibly liberal Sufi Muslim who wrote an entire book on the harmony of religions, the confluence of oceans, I think he called it. And he was killed by his Muslim brother. He's put to death. He's executed by his more fanatical Muslim brother. So if you're asking me how to, reduce fanaticism, that's a tall question. As I said, it's beyond my pay grade. But, ideally what you do is bring to every religious practitioner's attention is the more liberal dimensions of their own home religious tradition, and encourage them to study that more deeply and to appreciate it more deeply, so that people don't kill each other and call each other names.
Okay, yeah, that makes. Oh,
thanks.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay. My other question was, I've just been thinking, like, if I was God and I wanted people to like understand me and to follow me, to like understand their truth and like actualize themselves, why would I like come in different forms? Wouldn't that just lead to confusion? Wouldn't it make more sense to just stay uniform so then everybody can understand the same thing? So why does God choose to appear in many different ways?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, the answer is just, you would be right if human nature was uniform, but that's not the empirical fact of the matter. And so Ramakrishna, he says, God has created different religions to suit people of varying temperaments and of different cultures. Because people, I've now lived in 4 countries. I've lived in the US and in Oxford and Germany and India, and people are not the same. They're wildly different. And so I can perfectly understand why God would appear in one way to Germans and another way to other Europeans and to Americans and in the Hindus. Just because, in fact, every human nature is at least somewhat distinct from every other. I mean, there's no such thing as 2 people who are exactly alike. And so is it a coincidence that God will appear in different forms to people of varying temperaments, right? That's Ramakrishna's logic.
All right, I think we're almost out of time, but if we have time, I'd like to do just one more quick question, which is I want to understand in Ramakrishna's view what impersonal means, because it seems like there's an ambiguity in at least two ways that could be read. So one way of reading it is that God has features that are personal and features that are not personal. So just to use an analogy, like I encounter my son and I can encounter him as a person, or I can encounter him as just a massive object, right? Like if he jumps across and hits me in the face, like that's encountering him in kind of a non-personal sense, like a physical sense. Whereas if I have a conversation with him, I'm encountering him in a physical sense. But there's another way of reading impersonal, which is the denial of having personal traits. And at least when, as far as I've understood what's happening in the kind of non-dual Advaita Vedanta kinds of views, the claim is the latter, not the former. It's not that God
Correct.
has personal traits and traits that aren't personal. It's that God does not have personal traits.
Correct.
So he is denying that other claim then, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's the latter, exactly. I mean, he means nirguna in the sense of denial of personal traits.
So sorry, it is the case that God has personal traits and does not have personal traits?
Yeah, in different aspects.
But I don't see how that works. So then God has personal traits. and like God
in
can
one aspect,
present.
yeah. So I mean, to give you one example, I mean, Ramakrishna says when I think of God or experience God as static or as inactive, nishkriya is the Bengali term, then I call it Brahman. And when I think of the same God as creating, preserving, and destroying the universe, then I call it personal God.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So that
but I mean, doesn't that just imply then that like the aggregate features of God include personal traits?
Yeah, exactly. But the Advaitins are not, they don't accept them. And they,
right.
And
so they're just wrong about that.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing about this pluralism is that, it just, it affirms a certain truth, like a certain true worldview, and then says, on the basis of this true worldview, I can accept the equal salvific efficacy of your path, even though your truth differs from mine in certain respects. And I can accept, that's the idea.
Yeah. Okay, good. So depending on how we mess with the terms at the beginning, like this, there's different ways of defining inclusivist. The way
exactly. So this is the way I put it in my new book is that it's nonetheless a second order inclusivism about truth.
Okay.
In order to secure and justify a first order salvific pluralism, pluralism at the level of salvation.
Yeah.
Because it's a logical necessity to be inclusivist from the standpoint of truth at some point, right? Yeah.
Okay, good. That makes sense then. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Swamiji.
Thanks so much. Thank you all. Thanks for the brilliant questions. I'm very impressed, actually.